So there's a train show in January around here. I used to go as an exhibitor with my father, but I haven't gone in a few years. This is partially because of lockdowns, but also because my father keeps forgetting to sign up for the show now that it's started up again. In the past year, though, I've found a new joy in modeling. I've always thought it would be too hard for me, but I guess I never really gave it a real chance before. Every layout we've brought in the past has been entirely my father's work, and I'm sure we'll bring one of his setups again this year, but I want one of my own to bring. I want to show off what I've learned, I want to show off my talent, and you know the best way to do that? Finish up my 4x6 foot sectional layout. But if I'm being honest, that layout is annoying to move, and I'm feeling a little bit ambitious today. With the deadline being only around 2 months out, let's do something stupid and make my life way harder than it needs to be. This is the Little Loop Railroad. I'm sure many of you returning viewers remember it, but it's been a month and a half. Let's do a quick recap. The Little Loop was a small set of trains and tracks that I decided to take with me on vacation to show off my modeling passion to family. I only had 2 weeks to get the entire setup prepared. It was a nightmare, but a fun nightmare, and when we actually got out on the vacation, a great conversation starter at the big family cookout. But after only 3 episodes, the project just stopped. After the vacation, there wasn't anything left for me to do with it, and I started focusing on the Halloween project instead. In the middle of October, however, I decided it would be fun to run the Little Loop one last time on a livestream. And during that livestream, someone made the silly suggestion that I make the Little Loop a more permanent setup. A long story short, we didn't have enough leftover On30 track, and the only spare building kit I had was a tiny engine shed for Snickerdoodle. It was gonna cost us a good amount of money to get this project started, and I didn't really have it in the budget to build this layout. But soon after the stream ended, I realized something. My father, as an HO modeler, has an abundance of track that I could use. On30 trains run on HO gauge. Now, it wouldn't look as nice as true On30 track, but it would save us a lot on the cost for this layout. And scenery is pretty easy too. Once again, my father has an abundance of materials. He has a stockpile of grass, of trees, of dirt. Now, buildings are a little more trouble, but if I'm focusing on the Little Loop Railroad instead of the 4x6 plan, I can just use the buildings that I bought for the 4x6 plan, right? I've got a couple of kits floating around. This idea is a little bit crazy, but I like crazy, so let's do it. To start, I needed a track plan, and boy oh boy, I have those in spades. Now, I won't bore you with going over every track plan that I have, at least not today, but I did want to highlight a few that I made in this creative process of planning the layout. The first plan that I ever designed that was around the size of the Little Loop was this smaller variant of the main model railroad that I wound up making. Actually, this is the original plan that I wanted to make. However, my father heavily encouraged me to reconsider my track plan so that it would have 18-inch minimum radius instead of 15-inch. I think it was the right call. My father wound up buying me a Forney for Christmas, and Forneys do not like 15-inch radius curves. Plus, that switchback in the middle of the plan takes up a lot of room. There wouldn't have been much space for scenery. It took me quite some time before I designed another layout that was within this 3x4 foot scope, but eventually I designed this, the Heartless and Coin River Railroad. Now, I did design this with Halloween in mind, but that doesn't mean I can't rework it into something more appropriate for all times of the year. However, for the Little Loop, I've got that engine shed I want to use. This plan just doesn't have the scenic room for a shed. It would need a pretty serious rework. Fortunately, the Heartless and Coin River is actually a rework of a plan that had a shed. Unfortunately, that previous plan has one glaring flaw. It's designed as a Thunder Mesa lookalike. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the scenery of Thunder Mesa, but I want to try and create something of my own style rather than just copy another YouTuber, especially as I'm trying to find my own footing and break into the model rating scene on YouTube. I'll probably do a Thunder Mesa lookalike some other time, but for now I decided to do this plan. It's a little weird, and a little ambitious, to split a railroad this small down the middle into two biomes. I want to do this because I got inspired by some real-world railroads. Those are the Cumbres and Toltec, and the Durango and Silverton. Both of these are tourist railroads in Colorado, built out of remnants of the Denver and Rio Grande Western. I really like this idea because the flat and open desert contrasts the tall and enclosed mountain forests, and if done right, this should help to make the world feel bigger than it actually is. Now, the track plan itself is a little bit cramped, but I think I can make it work. Just to check, I set up some foam boards with a total surface area of roughly 3 by 4 feet, and set up some building footprints and a basic train just to get a feel for how everything would fit together once actually built. Having a space to physically visualize your plan really helps, you know? For the base of the layout, my father and I went down to a local lumber store and bought a 2x4 sheet of plywood, which we paid a little extra to have it cut into 4 strips of 6-inch width each. We probably didn't need to do it this way, but it's what we wanted to try. At home, we set aside one of the 4 pieces because we didn't need it for this project, and for the other 3, we just cut them down to 3 feet long. Now, it wouldn't have cost us too much more to just get these cuts done at the lumber shop, but the foam boards that we were planning to use as the base of this layout were inconsistent in length by about 1/8 of an inch. So we had to cut each board slightly longer or shorter than 3 feet, and it was easier to measure and cut that while we were at home. With the wood cut, we glued the 2 pieces of foam together, and then glued the plywood strips to the foam. 2 pieces went on each end, and 1 piece covered the gap in the middle. For the glue, we used adhesive caulk. Now, this was a common material throughout this entire project, and we used a ton of it. I think we went through around 2 tubes worth of the stuff. We had to buy more on 2 separate occasions, I know that much. Now, I don't know if we needed to do this, but we decided to use some lath to frame the outside of the foam. We used these because they were cheap, thin wood strips that happened to all be about the length of the layout, around 4 feet, and their width was about the thickness of the layout, about 1.5 inches. The pieces we used were a little closer to 1 3/8 inches wide, but that seemed to work out okay. The main reason we used lath, however, was to keep the layout lightweight. This does need to be nice and portable for that show in January, after all. We gotta carry it up a flight of stairs. To keep the lath in place, we used some caulk on the foam, but for the wood we wound up using wood glue instead. This went along surprisingly fast as I focused on the caulking while my father focused on the wood glue. However, all of the lath was slightly warped along its length. To help combat this, we drilled some holes in the pieces of wood and hammered some nails into the lath to keep it straight at certain points. While the piece would still try to warp, the nails would somewhat prevent it from doing so. After using a rasp to flatten out any imperfections in the lath, we let everything dry overnight, adding some weight where we could to better hold the pieces together. By morning, everything was dried enough, and we had the perfect base to start our layout. I laid the track out as best as I could onto the layout, but not to attach it permanently. If you remember, on the track plan, there was a little river in the upper left-hand corner. I'm not building a train to Atlantis, I want that river below the tracks. The reason I'm laying the track now is so I can mark where it is, and then I can add some material along where the markings are to help raise the track. For this, we used Woodland Scenic's 2-inch foam track risers. Now, these risers could be easily bent into shape, but they would never hold that shape. They would always try to straighten out. However, we found that adhesive caulk would sort of freeze these pieces in place once they were bent, even before the caulk had dried. This was extremely convenient since I had already planned on using adhesive caulk for this. We were originally going to pin down the risers to help them hold their shape, but we wound up not needing to. Now, the hardest part of adding these foam risers was the switches. For the two that were by the station, also known as the ones closest to the camera's current position in the footage we're using right now, I didn't have to do anything special. I could just have the foam risers follow the trajectory of the sidings and then have them push up against each other where the switches needed to meet. The other switches were a little more trouble. For them, I wound up grabbing some old pieces of scrap insulation foam and cutting them roughly to the shape that would cover the big gaps between the risers. The foam wound up actually being taller than the risers, however, just by a little bit. So, once the adhesive caulk had dried, I wound up using the rasp once again to try and make it level with the rest of the risers. Before we could lay the track, we needed roadbed, and sure, we've raised the track, but that's risers, that's not roadbed, there's a difference. I just went with cork roadbed as it's kind of a family tradition at this rate. Being able to bend each half of the roadbed separately is nice. Once again, we used adhesive caulk for this, though while the risers held their shape with the caulk in place, the roadbed didn't, so we had to pull out a lot of push pins. The weirdest part about laying the roadbed is that I did not center the roadbed on the risers, very intentionally. I tried to make sure that the outer edge of the roadbed was always at least 2 inches from the edge of the layout. This led to some weird overhangs, and eventually it also led to some super sharp curves on the track. I think we got down to about 12-inch radius, but neither of those were much of an issue in the long run. After all, the overhangs weren't that large, and our locomotives and rolling stock can run on 9-inch radius, so 12-inch won't be that big a deal. The hard parts of laying cork roadbed came mostly at the switches, where we have to add enough material to support the diverging tracks. In some cases, this meant splitting the 2 pieces of roadbed to each diverging route and then filling in the middle, and in others, it meant cutting the roadbed for the curved leg of the switch at a weird angle. The engine shed was also a bit rough. I had to get a sheet of cork and cut it to the rough shape of the shed so that it would be approximately the same height as the track once we built the shed. The cork itself wasn't actually all that hard, but getting enough risers beneath the cork to hold it all up was a little bit weird. Fortunately, we had just enough leftover risers to complete the job. Last, but certainly not least, was the track. I've got a lot to say, but sadly very little footage of it. I guess I got tired near the end of the project as I usually do. I really gotta get better at that, man. The footage I do have is of us gluing down the track using some caulk, but not adhesive caulk like before. No. Clear sealant caulk. So different, I know. Now, sealant isn't quite as strong as adhesive, but the track isn't quite as structurally significant to the whole of the layout as the other joints that we've used caulk on have been. Plus, drying clear will make it easier to ballast the track in the future, since we don't have to worry about specks of white showing up between the rocks. And for the white tubes that you see in the footage here, those are just filled with water for weight. The track occasionally pushed itself up and off of the roadbed, so we just held it down with these weights while the caulk dried. Now, for the stuff I didn't record. As I mentioned before, we used HO Track to save on money. We wound up using Atlas Code 83 for switches and sidings, though we didn't finish the sidings by the time this was recorded. For the sharp curves on the main line, we wound up using some Microengineering Code 83. Microengineering's Flex Track is really good at holding a curve on its own, which wound up being super helpful for the sharp corners that we had on both ends of the layout. Once the curves were roughly in shape, we saw where the track would attach to the switches, then cut the curves to length and connected everything with rail joiners. After holding the track in place onto the roadbed with some pins, we got to caulking, which is what you see here. Cleaning up the caulk so it's not on the rails is very important, and something I actually failed. I remembered to get the caulk off the inside of the rail, but not the tops of the rail. We found this out the hard way when we were testing the track power initially. Fortunately, it was easy to just scrape off. I definitely wish I got more footage here. Hindsight is cruel, but with that, we let it settle overnight, and that was it. This isn't much right now, but it is a start. 1 work week of progress and we're already here. 2 months? That should pose no real challenge, honestly. Now, I don't know if we're going to be able to finish all the videos in time for the show. For instance, next week's video is going to be that community showcase thing. And there's at least one other special video I'd like to do between now and then. But that doesn't mean I'm not gonna try, and we're definitely getting this layout done on time. I am really happy with how this first step has turned out, and I'm super excited for what the future of this project holds. There's plenty of work to do, but that just means plenty of potential, right? Next time, which will be about 2 weeks from now, we'll work on the groundwork and the fascia for the layout, and maybe try to heavily scenic one of the 2 biomes. I hope to see you all then, and I hope you've enjoyed the start to our little journey. Thanks for watching. Cheers, folks.